Hello, 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 y'all. I am fortunate enough to be here today with Miss Ella, who I actually met in DC at an Impact 11 open house a few weeks back. Had a quick conversation with her and thought I gotta have her on here. She has a lot of very valuable information that is super niche specific to the target audience of Speaking to Expand. So, Ella, who the heck are you and what are you doing here today?
Well, first of all, Ryan, thank you for having me and thank you for sharing me with your audience. I know you take very good care of them, so I appreciate that very much. Yeah, you and I met in DC. I live just outside of DC, and I do three things predominantly, slightly too entrepreneurial for my own good, but I've had a consulting company since 2003. So we just celebrated our 21st birthday. Something fun should have happened there. Now, just saying that aloud. And that's corporate consulting in aerospace, in automotive, in federal and defense, et cetera, et cetera. And then I also have had a media platform for about 10 years now. And I have two podcasts under that name and a business service I'm about to launch under that umbrella as well. And then finally, I am the co founder of a nonprofit where we amplify women's stories in the media.
Cool. Well, hopefully, I know there's some construction going on in the background here. I can edit a lot of that out. But for you and your podcast, tell us a little bit more about that because I know that's what is awesome about what you're doing. And it's 0.5 top percent, right?
Yeah, it's a fraction of a percent. And that's fine. It's not why I do it, but sometimes it's helpful to know that when there are so many podcasts out there and there are so many to choose from, I care 10 times more about the quality and about the experience that I create. But On Air with Ella is my primary podcast right now, about to launch a second one, which is about success and failure and resilience and true stories from objectively successful people. I'm really excited about that one. It's called The Other Side of Success. That one's coming out very soon. Might even be out by the time this conversation airs. But my mainstay for a decade now has been On Air with Ella. And Ryan, that started very much as what I call a kale and squats podcast. Like it was very much like health and fitness and sort of barely disguised fat loss, that type of thing. And now, 10 years later, I'd say 5 years ago, I started morphing into, well, I started changing and evolving, if you will. And the show came right along with me. So I document a great deal of my health and fitness journey there that includes disordered eating and like finding a balance. So I definitely do not shy away from those conversations, Ryan. But it's now really 360 degrees of basically a woman's experience. So we talk about health, we talk about wellness, we talk about relationships and communication and sex after 35 and negotiation and communication, etc. So it's a lot more robust these days.
And if you were to go back 10 years ago when you kind of started it, and I know a lot of speakers who are, or aspiring speakers, professional speakers, or entrepreneurs who speak to grow their business like yourself, you don't really know where it's going to go, right? Where you started it, and you probably would have never predicted it kind of had taken this path as you were looking forward. So how did you kind of deal with that? Was it like organically evolving or growing, or the audience brought it in that direction, or tell me a little bit about that path?
I love that question for a couple of reasons. The answer might surprise you. When I started it, remember, I have a consulting company. My aim in life in that business was obviously to be taken seriously, to be a credible advisor for my clients. And these are large publicly held corporations. So when I started a podcast where we're going to talk about sex and exercise and, all of the topics I already articulated, I didn't want anyone to know about it. So part of my journey and to answer your question directly, when I started, I basically started completely anonymously. I did not use my name. Ella is a nickname for Elizabeth in the corporate world. I'm Elizabeth. Like it was as anonymous as it could possibly get. And, video was not a factor a decade ago. It wasn't a factor at all, hardly. So I wasn't worried about showing my face. And so to say that it's evolved, yeah, it's come along with me and I it. So that was a super interesting journey for me where I had this like wall up, this metaphorical wall up between what I did on the air and what I was able to talk about and the type of community I was able to build, and then how I made a living every day. And that lack of integration turned out to be actually really problematic for me. It didn't seem so at the time, and my intentions were good, but the show really grew pretty fast. And so was sort of managing that, and it got to the point where it was just unwieldy. I couldn't keep it a secret. That was unmanageable. But also, just I wasn't comfortable with like carving my life in half like that. You know what I mean? So it became a journey to integrate both sides of my life. And that started about 4 years ago, and part of that meant obviously being bold and clear about who I was and having more integrity, and I don't mean honesty, I've always been honest, but integrity also implies a wholeness and a lack of division. Think about a whole number, an integer, and being able to bring all of my worlds together and hold events as Ella Lucas-Averett and be overt about who I was and the fact that I was actually running a consulting company at the same time that I was doing this. I don't know if that's of interest or use to anyone else, but that was an interesting journey for me to go on, and now melding all of my worlds together.
It's interesting you mentioned that because you definitely, especially in speakers starting out, I remember when I joined the Speaker Lab, which was a different program and mastermind I still am part of today. But I remember they were talking about leveraging their social media, and I was
Mm.
working a job at the time, a 9 to 5 and that was the LinkedIn brand, and the Instagram was just personal for friends and family. And I asked them, and they said, no, you gotta have social media congruency across all platforms, the same photo, the same name, all that kind of stuff. And when you do that, XYZ will happen. And so, did you notice a pivot in your business or a leg up after you had that congruency across all socials, your brand identity? Once that was congruent, what happened?
I think I'm still confusing. My own parents don't know what I do. I think it's very confusing that I make a living in the consulting world, and yet I have this whole media. I mean, I have a legit media company now, not just this little side thing that I used to do. So I think it's a marketing textbook nightmare. But Ryan, I've never been bothered about doing things by the book. And I just have fully embraced my multi hyphenate status. And I know that's a little bit of a trope these days. I totally get that. But I also feel like we live in a world, probably for the first time in all of humanity, where I can genuinely be an amateur but competitive serious triathlete. I can be a business owner of a consulting firm. I can have two completely wildly different podcasts on the air, and the third leg of that stool that's not launched yet. I'm leaving something out. Oh, I can run a nonprofit with my partner. Like I truly believe that. I mean, isn't that amazing that we live in a time where that is possible now? And I think, when I was going to business school, I would have been pillared for even suggesting that this was a viable option for a future. But I would love to speak to somebody today who's feeling like they have got to put themselves in a box and say, not necessarily. The box has not yet worked for me. Now, you're talking about brand cohesion, and I appreciate that. I certainly appreciate that. But I'd be lying to you if I said that I'd got it perfectly nailed.
And so for you, kind of having the balance set and figure that out, I think you really validate the concept that nobody knows what they're doing, especially when you start out. You just throw spaghetti, you see what works, and when that
Mm.
works, then you do this and then this and then this. For you, I obviously, who we serve on this podcast, keeping that in mind, how did you leverage speaking on top of all of this? You were working in corporate, it sounded like, to start, and you had the consulting firm, and then you had the podcast, kind of anonymous from the consulting, and then where did speaking kind of play into that?
Speaking played into that, in that I was doing an enormous amount of speaking in my corporate existence. So that might be speaking at a conference, and maybe that's 200 people and maybe it's 2,000 people. It might be leading something smaller, but really high stakes, right? And so I really had to refine my voice in the corporate environment. However, I've always been interested in what we call public speaking, which I think is so funny. Like, why do we call it public speaking? As compared to what? But speaking from the stage, right? Never been shy, never not been interested in that, but really came to the stage from the corporate side of things, from the business world. And of course, getting my jollies, having my own microphone and my own show for many, many years, and never even thinking about leveraging my podcast. I mean, for many years, not even thinking about leveraging my podcast to create speaking opportunities. So jokes on me. That's a brilliant way to amplify your brand and to position yourself as a speaker. It took me a little too long to crack that nut, I'm afraid.
So tell me more about that, because I think that's a lot of even sales calls I get on these days. The people I'm talking to, it's, hey, how can I break into corporate speaking? How can I start building my personal brand? And a lot of times I say, I can help you in one way, but that's, a paid package. But the way that I can just share with you right now is how, I definitely recommend you guest on podcasts that have your ideal audience. That way you're kind of well known in your spheres with the people you want to be well known as. And that tends to be very relevant these days, and still kind of how the market is flowing with, it's a newer thing, concept, way to grow your business. And a lot of gigs that I go to now, especially that are organized by entrepreneurs and social media personalities, I went to one a few weeks back. It was actually the day before we met in DC. It was an event in Atlanta, and the woman, the host, she asked everyone in the audience, raise your hand. And the audience was about 300-400 people. Raise your hand if you found out about me on someone else's podcast or on someone else's stage. And about half the people raised their hand. So it
Wow.
just completely validated that point. And yeah, it was really surprising. So how did you go about kind of building your podcast, leveraging that for speaking, and then leverage podcast guesting to grow your podcast, your own podcast, and your professional speaking?
Yeah, well, let me be really straight with you. I think it'd be so useful to have a conversation about the challenges therein, because I do not want to pretend for 1 second that I'm sitting up on the mountain and telling people how to get up here. Absolutely not. I am hiking up that mountain with you. And here are some of the challenges that I find. So, corporate speaking came easy because I was in an environment, they have a problem, I can solve it. And then people see you do it, and then they ask you to do another thing and another thing. And that, like anything, it's about momentum, right? Like anything. When I leave the bubble of the spaces in which I am already known, it's so funny. It's like, are you fly a lot? Name an airline that you are a frequent flyer on and you have status.
Well, I guess American.
Okay, me too. So on American, I might get greeted. Oh, hello, Miss Lucas-Averett. It's so good to see you. Like, welcome back. And I might get a nice, comfy seat. And then when I fly United, they're like, don't know you, enjoy the back. Okay. It's like I am the same person, but I'm having a completely different experience, a totally different reception. It ain't the same. Isn't it like that when you're trying to switch verticals, or when you're trying to leave your bubble, or when you're trying to put a stake in the ground outside your already established territory? It is for me. Have you had that experience?
100%. Imposter syndrome starting a podcast. Who the heck am I to serve this kind of person when I got started? 100%. Yeah.
Well, so let's talk about some of the practicalities. Some of the practicalities are, I'll give you an example. I have a keynote about accountability, and accountability is a subject I could talk reams about. I can talk about accountability from a personal development, personal growth. Who are you trying to be? Kind of keynote. I have that nuance. And then I have a completely, well, I shouldn't say completely, a very nuanced package B, which is for a corporate audience. And it is talking about how accountability drives business results, and how if you are leaving this bit off the table, it's an opportunity cost. Now, it's the same principles, but in one, I'm talking about meeting your personal fitness goals and your life goals. And in the other one, I'm talking about getting positive business outcomes. Now, Ryan, I am very comfortable and capable of speaking about both of those in front of two different audiences. The marketing of them is completely different. And so to sort of circle back, one of the struggles, I don't know if you've had this, is I might have delivered a keynote. It was great. It was brilliant. It was really well received, but it was very corporate. I'm wearing something that's more appropriate for a high corporate environment. The room is not fantastic. It's not sexy. It doesn't have like amazing lighting. You know, maybe the ceiling looks kind of low in the video. And I have like years of experience doing this. And you know what I don't have for it? I don't have key video to make a reel for myself, to make my speakers reel. So just these mundane practical things that you absolutely have to be participating in the commercial circuit and the pitch. I'm fine. I like it. That stuff drives me crazy. I hope someone can relate to this. I just want to show up and be like, no, I'm really good at this. You want to try me? And that ain't a strategy, to be clear, not a strategy. Have you had any experience where you've been trying to switch or evolve into your next rung and you're like some of these smaller things are holding you back? Have you had that experience?
Oh yeah, of course. Yeah.
That type of thing drives me crazy, and it's 100% on me. It's 100% my responsibility. I think that one of the traps we can fall in, so you have to be super careful, but I think one of the best things that we can do when we're trying to grow and we're trying to evolve past our current limits is to show up in every space that will have you. You and I met at something. I mean, I'm so happy that I met you. And I went to a thing that was a few hours long and it was clear across town. And as I'm trying to make my way over there through DC, I'm like, what is in it for me? That's at the end of the day, that's what we're thinking about everything, subconsciously or overtly. We're thinking, what's in it for me? And I am so glad I showed up in that space, ended up speaking, which was totally unanticipated. And I got to meet you. So my single best advice for someone who's trying to grow past their current territory is to show up in every space that will have you. That works until it doesn't. There's risk there, obviously.
I think you remember when Rachel spoke, I think she said something that really touches on that. She said, your invitation is the indication of your qualification, like to speak there, to be there, all that kind of stuff. And it sounds like that's kind of what you're saying. What you've been podcasting for how long has it been now? You said 10 years?
Yeah. Yeah.
Do you consider your podcast a stage?
Oh, hell yeah. Yes. I consider it a stage and a dinner table. And that's really
Hmm.
important. So I have an enormous amount of respect for the intimacy of the medium. And it drives me crazy when people don't. So when people, my stage, my definition and my yes in answer to your question is probably very different than some other people's. Meaning, I do not get on the air to broadcast a one-way message to drive wisdom into my listeners and to have basically a plenary session in which to enlighten them or entertain them. But that's not how I treat the stage either. So, yes, I very much consider it a stage, but for me, the stage, whether real or metaphorical, is a space to create rapport, to create interaction, to share knowledge, to impart wisdom when it's available. You know, I do a lot of interviews, so I don't claim to be the wise one, and to entertain, but always in a two-way exchange, which might sound funny because when you're doing a podcast, it's you and your laptop, right? Like you can't, except when we get to have a dialogue like this, you know, you're obviously not interacting with the listeners. I think the best podcasters in the world truly believe they're interacting with the listeners. They have the listeners in mind and they create experiences where it feels that you are sitting at a table together over your favorite beverage. So, yes, but with an asterisk.
And so that brings up an interesting point. When you kind of started guesting on other podcasts, when did you start doing that, or when did you even realize, oh, that's possible? Because you started kind of in OG podcasting days 10 years ago. We're in 2024
Yeah.
right now, so 2014. Podcasting wasn't really a thing back then. So how did you
No,
kind of
you're exactly right. I didn't mean to overtalk you, Ryan. I'm sorry.
right,
Yeah, you still had to tell people what a podcast was, for sure.
yeah,
Like, it's a radio show, but I could not believe the first time someone asked me to come on their show. And I was like, "Wait, what do you mean?" But equally, Ryan, I was uncomfortable the first time I did a solo show because I my goal at the time was to bring experts on the air to dispel myths and to create understanding about topics that I cared about in health and wellness and many other issues, right? And it never occurred to me that somebody would want to hear anything from me. And a funny thing happened. I had positioned myself, this is a bit of a sidebar, but if you'll humor me, I had
of
positioned
course.
myself as someone who cared very much about health and wellness. I told you this the topics have evolved since then, but that's what it was, unapologetically at the time. And so when I started having my own struggles in that vein a few years in, maybe 4 years in, I almost couldn't get on the air anymore. I was like, I am supposed to be this bastion of health and wellness, and I'm a triathlete, and I like to be fit. And I was really struggling. I was struggling mentally and physically and spiritually. And I thought, wait, I think I might be a fraud. I think I might be fake. And that's not cool. Like that's not okay with me. That's not my DNA. And so what I did, and remember, I'm still in protective mode. I still don't want to confuse like the microphone and the boardroom, right? So I still have my guard up. And I remember sitting in my dining room recording a podcast by myself. And I went on the air and I said, I feel like a fraud because I exist. And then I shared essentially what I just said to you. I said, this is what I share with you. And yet it's not what I'm living right now. Right now, I'm binge eating, I'm struggling. And I was extremely open for the first time in my life in any kind of public way like that about what I was dealing with. And Ryan, spoiler alert, like I'm sure this doesn't surprise you, that exploded. My show was never the same. The community was never, they were like, ah, the human, like there she is.
Right.
And to be able to reveal myself like that, and I don't think you have to get on and share every nook and cranny of your life. I'm not about full disclosure, but I do think that, intelligent, aware people know where the line is between full disclosure and being authentic and being true to yourself and to your audience. It wasn't until I lost the plot that I entirely found it. I think I got away from your question. I'm so sorry.
No, that I think that it actually kind of spins it in an interesting way because you realize that your authenticity through your vulnerability was the pivot kind of thing you needed to step into your own voice, it sounds like.
100%. And thank you, because you're exactly right. That was when I started getting asked on other people's shows. I'd never pitched myself before because why would I? I had my own show. Like it never even occurred to me. And I wasn't selling anything. And so that was around the season where I started being asked on other people's shows. And then I was like, well, hold on. I've been an entrepreneur. I've started two other businesses that aren't worth, I've sold, but so they're not worth, they don't come up in my bio. But I was like, wait a minute. I've had a successful business for at that time, I don't know, a decade. It's now been, like I said, 21 years. And I'd started another business and that was going well and blah, 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 blah. And I was like, yeah, I probably have something to say. I probably have something to contribute. But once I started making appearances on other people's platforms, whether it was to talk about why we should care about taking care of our bodies, even when we're extremely busy working adults, who have kids or whatever. We have other demands on our time. It's not about having kids, it's about having other demands on your time. And why prioritizing yourself isn't in fact selfish, or whether it's talking about accountability, or whether it's talk about starting a business and the challenges and the adventures therein. It was so cool to discover that I had something to share. That was very cool. And for those who are joining us today, I want to say it's one of the very best ways, if you're interested in speaking, one of the very best ways to let, your various communities sample the goods.
And so from a strategy, it makes sense. Tactically, how did you go about it once you started getting the invites in? Did you also start doing some cold outbound? And how did you go about doing that?
Okay, I have not done cold outbound, but that's because I have too much going on and I've put myself in a situation where I 3 businesses is too many, and that's what I'm doing right now. Two's great. I'm doing 3, it's kinda silly. I want to and I will, but I have a lot to say about it because I don't cold pitch, but I do receive about 10,000 cold pitches a week. That's hyperbole, not literal, but
Okay.
it feels like it. Like my inbox is overflowing. So I would love to share some tips. And I'm not your expert on this, but I can give you several years of experience on what to do and what not to do, certainly.
Shoot, let's hear it.
Well, okay. So the one thing, there are kind of 2 ways to pitch, right? Cold pitch.
Okay.
Now, warm pitches are always the best. Let's actually start there. Warm pitches are always the best. So obviously, if you have someone, I'm going to use my example because it's very easy. It's easily transferable to your own circumstances. But I have a podcast. So whatever you have, right? I have a podcast. So whoever comes on, when we hit it off and we establish rapport, it's not at all cheeky for me to say, "Hey, I'm really interested in spreading the message about X. Do you know anyone in your network who would appreciate that message or who could use that?" That's a very gentle ask in a warm situation. And if the answer is, "Oh, I'll think about that," that's a no for me. And we move right on. There's no skin in the game. Absolutely fine. No hard feelings, right? A warm pitch is always going to go much better. If somebody I know comes to me, if you come to me, Ryan, and you're like, "Listen, I really think that you should have Bobby on your show. Bobby's amazing." I'm going to give that much more consideration than a cold email, right? Just the way it works. Okay. So I think the first takeaway there really is to think outside of the box on who you would consider in your network and who it would be reasonable to offer a slightly warm, slightly above room temperature ask, right? From whom you could solicit that. So that's that. Now, some people will be like, "That's not a tip." Like, "That's hard. I'm uncomfortable." And I would say, sit in that discomfort. You know people. Like, ask. All right. Let's talk about cold pitches, though. And the number one mistake that I see in cold pitches, actually, there are so many, it's hard to number them. But if you don't tell me what my audience will get from you, what outcome you will create, what takeaway they will have, what will they know that they didn't know before? What will they experience that they hadn't experienced before? If you just told me that in one sentence and left your contact information, you would hear back from me if it was a fit. Does that make sense?
Well, yeah, because I mean, at the end of the day, it's even like your social medias. It's not your content isn't the asset; it's the audience you're building. That's the asset you're building. And when you pitch someone adding value to growing your asset, it's just kind of a no brainer if it makes sense to the asset you have, your audience.
What people do though, Ryan, and I understand why, but what they do is they pitch themselves. So every solicitation I get is somebody pitching themselves with very few exceptions. And you get it, right? Like it makes sense. If you're trying to get a job, you're pitching yourself. If you're trying to get a gig, you're probably pitching yourself. I would encourage you to put yourself at the bottom. If I want to know more about you and I want to know your story, or hell, how about I just get your link to your website? Like, how about you save us both some time? If you stop pitching yourself and instead pitch the value the audience gets, you will get a different result. So I was saying there are 2 or 3 ways that people cold pitch. And one is they have an agency cold pitch them, and they just email a press kit, their speaker's kit, and it's what everybody has seen and is already familiar with, but obviously your bio, maybe a couple of topics you could speak to, maybe a couple of shows that you've been on, and then all of your handles and your links, right? That's very, very standard. I get cold pitches and I do accept them. I might get 30 in a week and I might accept 2 in a month, to let you know how those numbers go. But if I happen to be interested in putting a show out about ayahuasca or microdosing psilocybin, and somebody happened to email me in the past 4 weeks about that, I'm not going to not pursue that because I got a cold pitch. I mean, that would be insane. So that happens, as I said, maybe less than 1% of the time. I didn't do the math. I just make math up, but you get it, right? And then the other way to cold pitch is to just email the person yourself. Now, I think that a lot of people think that that makes them look small or unprofessional or like they're not a big enough brand. And I totally disagree. I completely disagree. I think if you take on my first tip, if that aligns with you and you pitch the value you can add to the audience in whatever way is true and meaningful for you, if you can pitch that, I don't care if I'm not impressed if that came from your administrative assistant, your PR company, or your own email address. Absolutely does not matter to me at all. So I am not trying to do any harm to these agencies. I'm not trying to compromise their bag in the slightest, but you don't need them in terms of perception. You might need them in terms of scale. You might need them in terms of breadth and depth, but you certainly don't need them just based on perception alone.
That's really interesting. I've heard of few other two other tactical strategies. One of them was from a woman named Nina, who she spoke at the event in Atlanta as well. And she suggested, when her and I just talked after, she said, yeah, you know what I did, Ryan, she in her own head, she felt like she was a nobody, right? But she was having breakfast with Jeff Hoffman, the founder of booking.com, Expedia, like that whole sector. And people were asking her, like, who the heck are you why did he choose to give you his time? She said, I wrote him an email telling how I appreciated him sharing his story and how I integrated that into the nightly storytelling I told my kids so that they could grow up to be better entrepreneurs and overcome their own imposter syndrome. And then she basically wrote a paragraph of what the story was that she told her kids at night coming from him. And that was what it was, that he chose to have breakfast with her. Right. So that was one where that kind of sounds like what you're saying, of a random person taking the time to write a very detailed email. And then the other one was, well, first I want to hear what you think about that. Is that kind of what you were talking about, of the individualized?
Yeah, and I get the problems with that. Anyone could see objectively that you can't get scale doing that.
Yeah.
But my question to you would be, if you do it right, do you need scale? Like,
Right.
is doing that 10 times and having a win rate of 60% as fruitful as sending out 100 cold generic emails and getting 2 responses? I mean, again,
Right.
just making numbers up, but it's the spirit of what I'm saying. So that is the extreme because it happened to be authentic. But yes, I couldn't agree with that more, because let me tell you what that could look like in a scaled down, less amazing kind of way, right? But still
Sure.
authentic and still true. So let's say that I found you because I was looking for people to pitch myself to. Okay. I'm not saying we had a spiritual connection. I'm not saying in this hypothetical that the skies opened up and Ryan was presented to me and no, I was looking for people to pitch. Nothing wrong with that. Okay. In this hypothetical. And the worst way to pitch myself is to be like, hey, and then you can tell they copy and pasted the name. And then they say, I really love your last episode. And then they copy and paste the entire title, which nobody types, right? That's clearly a copy and paste. And they're like, I also can talk about blah. And then they copy, like the whole thing is this Frankenstein thing, and they've never heard your show. And they're, by the way, pitching you a topic that is not relevant to your show in the slightest. Okay. Let's compare and contrast that to someone who still finds someone, because they're marketing, they're scoping, they're out there looking. And I go to Ryan and I'm like, hold on, this looks like it might be something. So then I go to Ryan's podcast and I see what he's about. And then I listen to at least 2 of his shows. Maybe 3, maybe on 2x speed. That doesn't matter. Maybe I learn about who he is and what he's doing so that when I write to him, again, I don't have a spiritual connection with you. I didn't read to my children about you. However, I did my research so I can say, hey, Ryan, I love the value you create by X, right? By teaching people and sharing stories from the trenches about speaking and developing careers in speaking. One thing I haven't heard you address yet that I would love to speak with you about is XY. Correct? Forgive me if I'm wrong, but even if you have talked about XY, here's something unique that I think would be so valuable to your listeners. Would love to chat. Let me know if that's at all of interest. And then all of my contact information is below. That is a warm pitch. And it took me what? Like, how much longer did that take me? In reality, it probably took me a solid 20 minutes. Not nothing, not the same as pressing, send 100 times on a cold pitch. But would that land with you? Like, I don't know. For me, it would be a little
Yeah.
harder to toss that one in the bin.
Yeah. Almost out of respect too. Just like this person took the time to do their due diligence, investigate. I almost feel like I owe them just at least reading their email and then considering about it and thinking, yeah, okay, interesting. Yeah, that would make sense.
Yeah, I got one of those recently and it actually wasn't a good fit. They had listened to one show that led them to believe that I was a business podcast, basically. No harm, no foul on my side. But because they wrote to me, instead of just, moving it to the will read in 2037 folder, I I replied and I said, "Hey, thanks so much. Not a great fit, but you should definitely check out blah blah blah." And I mentioned a mid-sized show that they probably haven't heard of for whom they would be a perfect fit. And I hope they pursue it. But that's the difference to me between just getting, again, a cold call, which can work, and a warm call that took a few minutes to put together. And by the way, there's a 5-minute version of the story that I just shared. There is the cheap and dirty way to do that where you don't actually have to listen to one of their podcasts, but you can pay just a little bit of attention and write a slightly warmer intro. Can I share with you the third cold pitch version? That's my absolute favorite. I got one today. It's my absolute favorite cold pitch version 3 of 3. It is the DM in any social media environment that's like, hey, Ella, can I be on your show? That's it. That was the beginning, the middle, and the end.
That's it. There's no. Wow.
I have one in my DMs right now. And this guy was like, hey, Ella, love your vibe. I'd really like to be on your show. Can we chat? And I was like, okay, hold on. Like, first of all, I'm not a jerk. Like, I don't think that there's malintent behind that, but there is some audaciousness that I'm not loving. I'm like, what's my show about? What do you even talk about? Like, what in the ether made this even look like it could be a good fit for you? Like, that would be helpful for me to know. Like, no, you can't be on my show because you can't just show up and say, can I be on your show, with the minimal effort. Like, I've never seen less effort in my life. And again, I'm not trying to be a jerk. I hope I don't sound like a jerk. I'm just trying to compare and
It's true.
contrast that to someone who's focused on the audience and what value
All
they
right.
can create.
And I want to know what you think about this other method too. And this was one I learned from 2 guys. One was Pat Flynn and Sean Cannell. Connell, I don't know how to pronounce his last name. And what they said was really interesting. It was a strategy for, lower tier podcasts, meaning not huge numbers of audience,
Yeah.
to get big guests. And what they suggested was, if you go on someone who's got, let's say, 1 million followers, 300,000 followers on Instagram, they're normally following maybe a few hundred people, 1,000 people that are, their close knit social circle, right? And you get one of their close friends on your podcast, you have them on the podcast, and then you go back and you email them or DM them and say, hey, I just had this person on my podcast. Would you be interested in also making an appearance? If it's one of their close friends from high school, college, whatever it was, one of the few thousand people they're following, they see more credibility with it and think, okay, it was worth it for this person's time. maybe it's also worth mine. And have you had that tactic tried on you yet?
If it's been tried on me, I've been oblivious to it. I don't think there's
Okay.
anything wrong with it. It's manipulative, but manipulative just means you did it with intention to make something happen. It doesn't
Sure.
mean it's inherently bad. The risk there, obviously, I mean, some would just call that great marketing. I'd call it slightly manipulative marketing, but I don't think there's anything wrong with it. It's creating social proof in a way. Now, the best version of that is that you had someone on and you never would have even found them necessarily had you not been trolling through their very few contacts, right? Maybe that's a thing. But that person was in perfect alignment for your audience. If that's the case, who was harmed in that scenario? The risk, obviously, is that you go outside of yourself, you go outside of your lane. And what I mean is the community and the experience that you have promised to your listeners, your brand promise, and your show, what your show is about. And you go outside of your lane just to do that. And it makes no sense to your audience. And it makes no sense for your brand. And it's not on point for you. Like, that's the risk, is that you extend yourself beyond just to get to an outcome. That's more risk and not enough value for me. But on the
Hmm.
whole, I'd love to see it work.
Very interesting. At what point did you start to consider? I know you said you were doing 4 businesses right now, or 3 was it? You said 3
Three,
or 4? 3.
three.
At what point did you start to consider your podcast one of your businesses,
Oh,
or is it still
that's
not?
such a good question. That's such a good question. Okay. Very recently. So
Okay.
in 2017 or so, I started realizing that I had this amazing community. Like, I love my community so much. And I don't call them followers and I don't call them my tribe. They are neither. They are people who have chosen to be in this community with me. And they're amazing. And I realized, I mean, 7 years in, I was like, I should get together with them. So I started doing meetups in various cities. And then I held a retreat, and it was a small retreat where about 45 women came, and we spent the weekend together in Sedona in Arizona. And I was like, oh, wait. And now anyone who's ever run an event knows events don't make money. Events, like, you want to break even. That's the goal until you scale, until you scale, until you scale. But in any case, that was not a moneymaker for me. It was the first time I had even commercialized any aspect of On Air with Ella. That was mind boggling to me. Now, mind you, I'm running a consulting company the whole time. So my brain did not need or want to start treating On Air with Ella like a commercial endeavor. Because when I do things, I do them hard, right? And I didn't want to bastardize something that was really my passion project at the time. But it did open my eyes to the fact that, like, there really might be something here. Then several things, life goes on, blah, blah, blah. Then we had a pandemic and ain't nobody having any events. And then I had one as soon as I could. I guess it was in 2022, I think, in Miami. And I did the same thing. And it was great and it was wonderful. I am super interested in developing a model that is less like throwing a wedding. I don't know if you've ever hosted a 3-day event for 50 people, but it is like the most intense wedding you've ever organized in your life. You got to feed them, you got to house them, you got to take care of every hour, every minute of every single person's day. And they need to have fun doing it, and they need to have some swag, right? It's just a lot. And I thought there's got to be a more scaled down version. So right now, I am right in the middle of trying to figure out a model that is a little bit more turnkey, but no less amazing. So maybe it's a day and a half in major cities, or even B tier cities that that are accessible and easy for people to get to. In fact, I like that model more. But in any case, I am right in the middle of trying to do more than just advertising and affiliates, and really try and do what used to be called non-traditional revenue in terms of events and get-togethers. And plus, those are amazing. Like, you can change your life in a weekend by going to the right event with the right community for you.
Yeah, and it also makes you kind of realizes makes the community real. Whereas you might hear like, oh yeah,
Yeah.
your podcast has X amount of listeners, and you as a listener you can hear that and be like, oh okay, cool. They're probably meandering somewhere around the world. But then when you all get together, you're all in the same place. Oh my god, you heard that too? That you have that same problem? Oh you too? Oh my goodness. And that's got to be pretty cool, especially as the person hosting and organizing the actual event?
Yeah, it is move the needle impactful. If you're in the right place, obviously, if you're in the right place for you. Let's talk about the flip side of that. I have this second podcast and I've got 12 shows in the queue. I've got the trailer done. I've got all the branding done. The website's up. The reason I haven't launched it is because I realized that starting a second podcast without a why, without a business driver behind it is stupid. And so what I'm doing is I'm waiting for this other product that I'm working on that I keep referring to obliquely to be ready so that I can advertise it in this second podcast that I will be launching. Like I'm such a little baby who's been doing this for a decade. You can't believe I'm like in diapers still when it comes to being like, "Oh wait, I could actually create something here. I don't have to do 18 jobs. I could actually take all of my business acumen and put it into the
Mhm.
thing that I actually love." But yeah, it's a roller coaster.
So two more questions here because I know we got a hard stop in 6 minutes. Oh, and we're already over. So thank you for going over time here. For what advice do you have as from your experience running a podcast, growing, launching, scaling it, building events on top of it, monetizing it, commercializing parts of it, while running a consulting firm and a speaking business for yourself, all at the same, and a nonprofit all at the same time? What advice and or knowledge would you want to share with the aspiring speaker, professional speaker, or the entrepreneur that speaks to grow their business, all sitting here in this coffee shop listening to this conversation right here?
Well, I have controversial advice, but it's unsolicited, so you can do whatever you want with it, obviously. My controversial take would be don't start a podcast. And I'm not here to squash somebody's dreams, but there are a lot of podcasts out there. So I'm not saying never start a podcast. I'm saying start by speaking on other people's podcasts. You will develop a taste for it. You will develop a familiarity with it. You will have a tiny peek into the machinations behind what it takes to get one done. But Ryan, did you know I had no idea how much time and effort went into doing a podcast well? I think a lot of people do them to a different standard and it doesn't take them as much time, but still the minimum effective dose is you have to find the people to talk to if you include other people. You have to obviously have the logistics of coordinating that. Then you record the show. I don't know about you, but I do prep before shows. So depending on the complexity of the topic, I might research or I might just prep. Two different time scales there. Then I'm recording. Then there's the post production, right? Whether you edit or not, or whether you send it to somebody else, whatever you do there. And then there are the show notes and the transcripts and the blah, blah, blah. And then there's the promotion and the marketing. And by the way, you best have another one up for next week. Like it is intense. And so if anything about that appeals to you or you feel moved or called to have your own podcast, I would encourage you to go speak on 8 podcasts first. That's my challenge for you. Go find 8 to showcase your wares, and in the before or after chit chat with the host, ask them about it. Ask them what they wish they knew before they started. You will pick up gems. If it's your dream, if it's your calling, absolutely go do it. But maybe possibly do a few things first.
It's funny you say that because that's exactly what happened with me. Was I guessed it on a few, not even for my own business at the time. It was for another company I was working with, representing them. And I asked one of the hosts the same thing. She said, "Don't do it. It takes too much time, too much of your time, too much of your energy." And I had to go through a lot of loops before deciding to actually start, this one right here to see if it would even be worth my time. I'm very glad that I started it, but kind
Mhm.
of rationalized it for my own personal development of, okay, finding your voice, making content, enjoying talking to someone. My friends would make fun of me for always asking people so many questions. I'm like, wait, why don't I just make that into a podcast and enjoy it and have that make build an audience, etc. And build a community. 2 minutes left here. You've gotten and given so much value here for the listeners right now. Where can they find you on the internet after we wrap this up?
Oh, you're kind to ask. Thank you. Listen, I'll make it dead easy. I'm on air with Ella everywhere. And I'm Ella Lucas-Averett, and there's legit only one of those in LinkedIn. So find me.
Awesome. Well, guys, if you're listening here and you're a speaker, professional, aspiring, or an entrepreneur that speaks to grow their business, and you found value in what Ella was saying here and sharing how she balanced all the businesses at the same time, or how she grew her podcast, how she decided to even monetize it, how it turned from a passion project to what it is now, share it with a friend that you think would get value from listening to it. That's the only way that this podcast grows. There's no money behind it. It's drop a review, share it with a friend, and enjoy the rest of your day. Cheers, y'all. Thank you, Ella.
Thanks, Ryan.